plane now. You are a threat to others.
She boarded the flight like any other passenger, but moments later, she was forced out for no reason. Years later, she returned, and what happened next will leave you stunned. Subscribe now and witness the full story unfold. I still remember the look on her face that day, wide-eyed, breath quickening, lips parting like she wanted to explain herself but couldn't find the words. The smell of strong coffee and recycled airplane air filled the narrow cabin, while somewhere behind us, an impatient passenger muttered something under his breath. The hum of the engines masked most of the murmurs, but not hers. Her voice cut through the air like a sharp blade, and every word landed in my chest like a stone. It wasn't my flight. I wasn't even supposed to be on that plane. I was on standby, hoping to get home in time for my niece's school recital. She'd been practicing for months, and I promised I'd be there. But my standby ticket didn't come with guarantees, and when I finally got the call that a seat had opened up, I didn't care where they put me. A cramped middle seat between two strangers was still a ticket home. That's when I saw her. Perfect hair, perfectly pressed uniform, and that polite but firm tone only flight attendants master. She was making her way down the aisle with the confidence of someone who had repeated this same pre-flight ritual 1,000 times. But there was something else, something colder, in her eyes when they landed on me. It started small. A raised eyebrow when I asked for help with my overhead bag. A clipped response when I said, "Thank you." I brushed it off at first. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she'd had a long day. But then the man in the seat beside me, a white man in a business suit, asked for help with his luggage, and her tone softened. She smiled at him. She even called him sir. That's when the first remark came. Not loud enough for everyone to hear, but loud enough for me. Maybe if you packed lighter, you wouldn't need so much help. I froze. Was she talking to me? The man next to me didn't even look up for his phone. My lips parted to respond, but she had already moved on. I told myself it wasn't worth it. I was tired, I wanted to get home, and arguing wouldn't get me there faster. But then, as passengers settled in, she returned. This time, her voice was louder, directed at me, but angled so the people in the nearby rows could hear. "Ma'am, you'll need to keep your voice down. You're disturbing the other passengers." I hadn't spoken a word. My heart thudded in my chest. Heads turned. A few people glanced at me, then looked away quickly, pretending not to see. I tried to protest, but she cut me off. "If you can't follow the rules, I'll have to ask you to deplane." It happened so fast, I almost didn't believe it. She gestured to another flight attendant, whispered something in his ear, and moments later, I was being told to grab my belongings. No explanation, no warning, just the cold, practiced smile of someone who knew her authority was unquestionable. I stepped into the jet bridge, my carry-on dragging behind me like dead weight. The air outside the plane was cooler, sharper, and the silence was deafening. I could still hear the murmur of passengers settling in, the faint click of overhead bins closing. And then, the door shut. The engines roared. My flight, my only way home, was gone. I stood there, stunned, as the plane backed away from the gate. I caught a final glimpse of her through the small window in the door. She was laughing at something another attendant had said, her back to me, already moving on as if I had never existed. They told me there was nothing they could do. The flight was full. There were no other departures to my destination until the following day. I spent the night in the airport, my head resting against an unforgiving plastic chair, my phone battery dwindling until it died. I didn't make it to my niece's recital. She called me later in tears, asking why I hadn't come. Elite. I told her I got sick. I couldn't tell her the truth, that a stranger had decided I didn't belong on that flight, and no one had stopped her. That night, something inside me shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just went quiet. But the quiet wasn't empty. It was heavy, loaded with a resolve I didn't know I had. I had been humiliated, and I couldn't undo it. But I could choose what I would do next. I went back to work the next day, my job at a small marketing agency, paying just enough to cover rent and groceries. But every time I saw her face in my mind, every time I remembered the way she looked past me like I was invisible, I felt the same burn in my chest. That burn became fuel. I started taking extra projects. Long nights, early mornings. I signed up for online courses, poring over marketing analytics until my eyes blurred. I stopped going out on weekends, saving every dollar I could. My friends thought I was being dramatic when I said, "I'm not going to live like this forever." They didn't know about that day. I never told them. It was my secret reason, my private push forward. Months turned into a year. Then two. Promotions came slowly at first, then all at once. I went from managing small accounts to heading entire campaigns. My name started to circulate in boardrooms I had never been in. But still, every time I boarded a plane, I felt my pulse quicken. Every time a flight attendant walked past me, I braced myself for that same dismissive glance. I told myself I was over it. That was just one person on one day. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about her alone. It was about every time I'd been told, in ways big and small, that I didn't belong. She had just been the one to push me out the door, literally. Then came the night everything changed again. I was flying to New York for a conference. My company had booked me in first class. My first time sitting there. I wore my best suit, my hair neat, my briefcase perfectly packed. I stepped on the plane and felt the strange mix of pride and nervousness that came with knowing you had earned your seat. And that's when I saw her. She was older now, a little more tired around the eyes, but the same precise uniform, the same practiced smile. Her eyes flicked to me, and for a moment, I thought she didn't recognize me. But then something shifted. Her smile faltered. Her steps slowed, and in that split second, I knew she remembered. She opened her mouth to speak, but the captain's voice came over the intercom, calling her to the front. She gave me a polite nod and moved on, but the flicker in her eyes stayed with me. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. It was calculation, like she was trying to decide how to play this. I leaned back in my seat, the leather cool against my skin, and for the first time since that day, I felt no burn in my chest, no sting. Only a strange, quiet curiosity about how this flight would end. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the last time our paths would cross. The flight took off without incident, but my mind didn't. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, feeling the faint rumble of the engines through the seat, trying not to stare at her. I told myself to focus on the work I had to present at the conference, on the fact that I had finally reached a place I dreamed of. But my thoughts kept circling back to her. Her voice that day, the way she had ushered me off that plane like I was a problem to be removed. In the quiet moments, when the cabin lights dimmed and the hum of conversation faded, I wondered if she thought about it too. Did she even remember why she had done it? Was it personal? Or was I just another nameless face in a long list of people she had treated the same way? The questions gnawed at me, but I kept my face unreadable. Hours into the flight, she approached my row with a drink cart. Her tone was professional, her movements precise. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, eyes not quite meeting mine. I could have ignored it, could have let her move on without a word. But something in me refused to let the moment pass. "Water's fine," I said. And then, after a pause, I think we've met before." Her hand still for the briefest second before she reached for a bottle. "I don't think so," she replied, her voice steady. I took the glass she offered and held her gaze. "I'm pretty sure we have." A flicker crossed her eyes again, just a fraction of a second, but enough to tell me she remembered. She moved on without another word, but I saw the tension in her shoulders as she walked away. The rest of the flight was uneventful, but I caught her glancing at me now and then. Not the casual glances of a flight attendant checking on passengers, but the wary, measuring look of someone who didn't know what the other person might do. When we landed in New York, I let her walk past me at the door. She gave me a polite smile, the kind you give a stranger, and I returned it with one of my own. No words, no confrontation, just an unspoken acknowledgement that we both knew more than we were saying. The conference went better than I had hoped. My presentation caught the attention of a major client, and within weeks, they had signed a contract that doubled my department's revenue. I was offered a promotion, vice president of marketing. My salary jumped, my name appeared in industry publications, and invitations to events started pouring in. But success didn't erase the memory of that day. If anything, it sharpened it. I began to see my rise as more than just personal ambition. It was a quiet, deliberate refusal to ever let anyone have that kind of power over me again. Months passed, and life moved quickly. I traveled often for work, always in business or first class now. Sometimes I would think about her, wondering if she was still working the same routes, still carrying that air of unshakable authority. Then, one afternoon, on a flight from Chicago to Los Angeles, there she was again. She spotted me before I saw her. I noticed because her greeting to the man in front of me was warm, friendly, and then her smile froze when her eyes landed on me. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice polite but clipped. "Thank you," I replied evenly, stepping past her. I took my seat and settled in, aware of her moving through the cabin like a shadow that kept brushing against the edges of my vision. This time, I didn't wait for her to approach me. As she passed by during the boarding process, I said, "How long have you been flying?" She paused just slightly. "A little over 15 years. "That's impressive," I said, my tone neutral. "I imagine you've seen all kinds of passengers." Her lips tightened. "Yes," she said simply, and moved on. It was a strange dance we were doing, each of us acknowledging the other without naming the thing that connected us. I could feel her unease, though she tried to mask it. And if I was honest, I felt a certain satisfaction in that. Halfway through the flight, I stood to stretch my legs and found myself at the galley near the front. She was there, organizing drink cups. I leaned against the wall, my voice low so no other passengers would hear. "You don't remember me from years ago, do you?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "I remember every passenger I've had to remove from a flight." The words were sharp, but there was no conviction in them. I smiled faintly. "Then you remember why?" Her eyes flicked to mine, then away. "It's not personal," she said. "It was to me," I replied. For a moment, she looked like she might say something more. But then a chime sounded, and she excused herself, disappearing down the aisle. I returned to my seat, heart steady. I didn't need an apology. Not yet. I didn't even need her to admit she had been wrong. But I knew now that she remembered, and that was enough for the moment. Over the next year, I saw her twice more. Once on a short flight to Dallas, where we exchanged only the barest of words. And then again on a flight to Miami, where she avoided me entirely, delegating any interaction to her colleagues. Each time, I felt the same thing, a slow, growing sense that the balance had shifted. Then came the day that would tie everything together. It was spring, and my company was sponsoring a major charity gala in Los Angeles. The event was covered by national media, with celebrities, executives, and public figures in attendance. I was one of the speakers, introducing a new initiative we had launched to fund education programs for underprivileged youth. As I stepped off the stage to polite applause, I noticed a small catering team moving through the crowd with trays of champagne. And there, at the edge of the room, balancing a tray with quiet precision, was her. For a moment, I thought I was mistaken. But then she turned, and our eyes met. The tray wobbled slightly before she steadied it. She looked different. No uniform, no polished hair. Just a simple black shirt and slacks, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. I walked toward her slowly, the crowd fading around us. She didn't move. "Hello," I said, my voice calm. Her mouth opened, then closed. She glanced around as if looking for an escape, but there was none. We stood there, two people bound by a moment from years ago, now facing each other on completely different ground. I could see the recognition in her eyes, the calculation, the faint edge of embarrassment. And for the first time, I wondered if this was my moment. Not to humiliate her, but to see what she would do when the power was no longer hers. For a few long seconds, neither of us spoke. The noise of the gala swirled around us. Laughter from one corner, the soft clink of glasses, the murmur of conversations, but it all felt muted, distant. She held the tray, steady now, her fingers tight against the stem of a champagne flute. I could see the faint pulse at her temple, quick and insistent. She was the first to break eye contact. "Would you like a drink?" she asked, her voice barely above the background noise. I shook my head slowly. I'm fine. It wasn't the words that made her shift uncomfortably. It was the way I said them. Calm, measured, with the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to raise their voice to be heard. I could feel her searching for an exit from the conversation, some excuse to walk away, but the crowd was thick, and her role kept her anchored where she was. I didn't expect to see you here, she said finally, her tone caught somewhere between politeness and resignation. I could say the same, I replied. Her eyes flicked over my suit, the name badge clipped to my jacket, the subtle nods I received from people passing by. Recognition dawned, not just of me, but of what I had become, that I wasn't just a passenger anymore, or some face she could dismiss with a few clipped words. I was someone people now looked to, someone with presence in a room she was only serving. A waiter passed behind me, and she shifted slightly, the tray pressing into her ribs. "I don't know what you want me to say," she murmured. I leaned in, not to intimidate, but to ensure my words were for her alone. "I don't want you to say anything, but I want you to know that I remember. Every word, every look, every decision you made that day." Her lips parted like she wanted to protest, to explain herself, but no sound came. Instead, her eyes moved past me to a cluster of guests laughing near the stage, as if focusing on anything but my gaze might loosen the knot tightening around her. I could have walked away then. I could have left her there with her discomfort and the weight of our shared history pressing down on her shoulders. But I stayed, not because I wanted revenge in the traditional sense, but because there was something in her silence, a story she wasn't telling that I wanted to hear. "How have you been?" I asked, and though my tone was neutral, the question landed with the force of a challenge. She hesitated, then said fine, but the word rang hollow. I tilted my head slightly. Still flying? Her pause was just long enough to betray her. "No," she said finally. "I left last year." Something in me shifted at that. I had assumed she was still in the air, still wearing that uniform, still wielding the same authority that had once stripped me of mine. But the truth was more complicated. "What happened?" I asked. She glanced around again, as though checking to make sure no one was listening. "It's not important," she said, but the stiffness in her voice told me it was. I didn't push, not yet. Instead, I gave a small nod and stepped aside, allowing her pass. She moved quickly, the tray steady in her hands, disappearing into the crowd like she could vanish entirely if she just kept walking. But the image of her stayed with me all evening. While I shook hands and exchanged business cards, while I smiled for photographs, I kept catching glimpses of her weaving through the room, her shoulders slightly hunched, her eyes avoiding mine. And every time I saw her, the years between that day on the plane and tonight seemed to collapse in on themselves. By the end of the night, when the crowd began to thin and the music softened, I found her again. She was near the service exit, her tray now empty, her hair coming loose from its bun. She looked tired. Tired in a way I had never seen before. I stepped in her path. "Can I walk you out?" She blinked, surprised. "Why?" "Because," I said, "you and I have unfinished business." For a moment, she stood still, weighing the offer. Then she nodded, and together we stepped out into the cool night air. The city lights spilled across the pavement, and the sounds of traffic replaced the muted hum of the gala. We walked in silence for half a block before she spoke. "You want to know why I did it, don't you?" I didn't answer immediately. "I want to know if you'd do it again," I said. Her steps slowed. "No," she said quietly. "I wouldn't." That was not the answer I expected. "I was wrong," she continued, her voice low. "But that day, I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was keeping control of the cabin. And maybe I told myself that to justify it, but the truth is, I saw you, and I made a judgment, without knowing you, without listening. And I let that judgment decide everything." Her words were halting, but they landed with precision, each one chipping away at the image I had built of her over the years. I had imagined her as unshakable, unrepentant. But now, standing under the dim glow of a street lamp, she looked human, flawed, regretful. I stopped walking. "Do you know what that cost me?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "More than I'll ever understand. For the first time since we'd met, There was no pretense in her tone, no defensive edge, just quiet acknowledgement. I lost more than a seat on that flight, I said. I lost a moment with someone I loved, a promise I couldn't keep, and you didn't even know my name. Her eyes shone faintly in the light. I know it now, she said. We stood there for a long moment, the city moving around us. I realized then that I had been carrying that day like a stone in my pocket, heavy, always there, something I could feel with every step forward I took. And maybe, just maybe, hearing her say those words was enough to loosen my grip on it. I didn't forgive her. Not yet. But I saw something shift in her, a crack in the wall she had built between herself and what she'd done. We parted ways at the corner. I watched her walk away, her figure growing smaller until it was swallowed by the crowd. I didn't know if I would see her again, but I had the strange feeling that our story wasn't finished, that there was still one more chapter waiting for us. And I was right, because a year later, she would walk in my office, not as a server, not as a flight attendant, but as someone seeking a second chance. And in that moment, I would have to decide what kind of ending this story deserved. It had been almost a year since the night of the gala when she reappeared in my life. I had nearly convinced myself that our paths would never cross again. The memory of her face was still sharp in my mind, but it was no longer the constant, burning thing it once was. It had dulled into something quieter, like an old scar you only notice when you run your fingers over it. The day she walked in my office, it was raining. The kind of steady, gray drizzle that makes the city feel smaller, muffled. I was between meetings, my desk covered in reports, my phone buzzing with reminders. My assistant stepped in and said, "There's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." I was about to say no. My schedule didn't have room for unscheduled visitors. But something in my assistant's tone made me look up. And there she was, standing in the doorway, rain beating on the shoulders of her coat, hair damp, hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked different, again. Older, certainly. But there was also a deliberate steadiness in her posture, as if she'd rehearsed this moment and was determined not to waver. "Can we talk?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. I just gestured to the chair across from my desk. She stepped inside, setting her bag on the floor before sitting down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the rain tapping against the windows, the faint hum of the heating system. She glanced around the office, at the framed awards on the wall, the photographs from events and conferences, and I could see the flicker of recognition in her eyes. This was a different world than the one we'd met in. "I need a job," she said finally. It was not what I expected. I had imagined a dozen reasons she might be here. Closure, apology, some attempt to explain, but not this. She went on before I could respond. "I left the airline because I couldn't do it anymore. The hours, the travel, the way I started to see people as problems to be managed instead of individuals. After I left, I worked a few different jobs. None of them lasted. And now, I need something steady." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "Why here?" "Because," she said, "this company does work I believe in. And because I know you're in a position to say yes or no." Her honesty startled me. There was no attempt to disguise the imbalance between us, no sugarcoating. Just the plain truth. "Do you remember what you said to me that day?" I asked quietly. Her gaze didn't falter. Every word. "And you think I should help you now?" She took a breath, and for the first time, I saw something close to humility in her expression. Not the forced kind that comes from being caught, but the genuine kind that comes from living with regret. "I don't think you should do anything," she said. "I'm asking. That's all I can do." I could have ended it there. I could have told her no and sent her back into the rain with the knowledge that the past still had teeth. But as I looked at her, I thought about the years since that day, about how far I'd come, and how much of that journey had been shaped not just by the injustice of her actions, but by my decision to rise beyond them. If I turned her away now, would it be justice? Or just revenge dressed up as principle? I thought about the girl I'd been in that cramped airplane seat, humiliated and powerless. What would she want me to do? Finally, I spoke. "There's an opening in community outreach. It's not glamorous, and it's not easy, but it's a start. If you want it, you'll have to prove yourself, just like I did. Her eyes widened, and for a second, I saw something fragile break open in her expression. Gratitude, relief, and maybe disbelief. "I'll take it," she said quickly. I nodded once. "You start Monday." Over the next months, I watched her work. At first, there was an awkwardness between us, like we were both navigating the weight of the past without naming it. But she showed up early. She took the difficult assignments without complaint. She listened more than she spoke. Slowly, the rest of the team began to trust her. One evening, long after most of the office had gone home, she knocked on my door. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not slamming the door in my face when you had every right to." I studied her for a moment. "You're here because you earned the chance, not because I wanted to do you a favor." She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Still," she said, "thank you." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was something, and maybe I realized that was enough. Months later, at the annual company retreat, we stood together on a balcony overlooking the city lights. She leaned on the railing, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and said, "You know, the day I pulled you off that flight, I thought I was in control. I thought I was protecting something that needed protecting. But really, I was protecting my own biases. I didn't see it then. I see it now." I didn't respond right away. The air was cool, carrying the faint sound of music from inside. "People change," I said finally. "Do they?" she asked, almost to herself. "Sometimes," I said, "if they want to." She looked at me then, and for the first time since we'd met, there was no wall between us. Just two people standing in the same place, both changed by the choices they'd made. I thought about all the years I had carried that moment with me, how it had fueled me, shaped me, and in some ways haunted me. And I realized that letting it go didn't mean forgetting. It meant making sure the ending wasn't defined by bitterness. The story didn't end with her removal of me from that flight. It didn't even end with me giving her a job. The real ending was here, in this quiet understanding that we had both lived enough to know the weight of our actions. And as we stood there, I found that the burn in my chest, the one I had carried for so long, was gone. In its place was something lighter. Not forgiveness exactly, but release. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't watching someone fall. It's watching them rise and knowing you had a hand in how they got there. And in that moment, I realized maybe we had both finally reached our destination. It's strange how life, once it turns a corner, doesn't always sprint forward. It drifts. Quietly, almost lazily, until you realize you're standing somewhere you never thought you'd be. The months after that balcony conversation passed like that. Soft, steady, unremarkable in the way only peace can be after years of running on adrenaline and old wounds. She kept working in community outreach, and I kept leading the company. We saw each other daily, sometimes exchanging nothing more than a nod in the hallway, sometimes talking about projects late into the evening. But the past never really disappears. It just waits. The reminder came one Tuesday morning in the form of an email. It was from a journalist, a name I recognized. She was writing a feature on workplace redemption stories and had heard rumors about a former flight attendant now working in my company under my leadership. She wanted to discuss the nature of our professional relationship and explore the history that made it unique. I stared at the email for a long time before forwarding it to her with a single line. "We need to talk." She came into my office that afternoon, closing the door behind her. "You saw it?" I asked. She nodded. "They called me too. And I didn't answer. I figure I should talk to you first." I studied her face. She wasn't panicked, but there was a tension in her jaw I hadn't seen in months. "If this comes out," I said slowly, "people will want details. They'll want to know exactly what happened that day. Are you ready for that?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "No, but I think I need to be." I leaned back, weighing the options. We could shut it down, refuse comment, and let it die in a week's news cycle. Or we could face it head on. "Do you trust me?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, with a faint, almost ironic smile, she said, "I'm here, aren't I?" We agreed to speak to the journalist together. When the day came, we sat side by side in a conference room, the city skyline behind us. The journalist, sharp-eyed, voice soft but unrelenting, asked us to start from the beginning. I told my part of the story in a calm, measured voice, sticking to the facts. She told hers with pauses, as though each memory cost her something to pull into the open. She admitted to her bias, her quick judgment, her unwillingness to see me as a person that day. The journalist didn't interrupt much, just listened, wrote, watched our faces, and then she asked the question I knew was coming. Why did you hire her? I glanced at her, then back at the journalist. Because someone once gave me a chance when I didn't deserve it. And because holding on to anger is a full-time job, and I already had one. The journalist's eyes flicked to her. And why did you take the job? Her voice was quiet, but steady. Because I needed more than work. I needed to prove to myself I could be different. When the article came out, it went viral. People debated in comment sections, on talk shows, in coffee shops. Some called me a fool for giving her a chance. Others called her brave for taking it. Many said they could never have done what I did. But the thing about other people's opinions is, they're just noise if you know why you're doing what you're doing. The attention brought new opportunities for the company, invitations to speak at conferences about leadership, diversity, and second chances. I started taking her with me to some of those events. At first, she resisted. They'll just see me as the villain, she said. Then give them a better story to tell, I replied. And so she did. I watched her stand on stages, facing audiences of hundreds, sometimes thousands, and talk about the power of confronting your own prejudice. She didn't sugarcoat her mistakes, didn't paint herself as a victim of circumstances. She owned it, and in doing so, disarmed people in a way I never could. One night, after a particularly intense panel discussion, we found ourselves sitting in a quiet hotel bar, nursing glasses of water. She stared into the amber light, reflecting off the polished counter. You know, she said, when I pulled you off that flight, I thought I was saving the passengers from some imagined threat. But really, I think I was trying to protect my own comfort. And I can't believe it took me years to see that. Most people never see it at all, I said. She glanced at me. And you? You never wanted to see me fail after you hired me? I thought about it. Once maybe, but then I realized you failing wouldn't actually make me any happier. If anything, it would make me sad. Sad? She repeated, almost disbelieving. Because it would mean all the pain from that day was for nothing. If something good can come from it, anything, then it's worth more than revenge. She didn't answer, but I could see something shift in her expression. Over the next year, we kept building, both the company and our strange, improbable trust. We weren't friends, exactly, but we were something. Allies, maybe. Co-authors of a story that had begun with humiliation and ended with, well, not quite redemption, but something close. And then came the conference in Atlanta. It was supposed to be routine. Keynote speech, breakout sessions, networking. But during the Q/A, after a joint talk, a man in the audience stood up. He was older, white-haired, with a sharpness in his voice that made the room still. My daughter, he said, was removed from a flight 2 years ago. No explanation, just humiliation. She's still not over it. You talk about second chances, but what about the people who never get one? The room was silent. All eyes were on her. She gripped the microphone, and I could see her fingers tremble. You're right, she said. Not everyone gets a second chance. And that's the part that keeps me up at night. Because I don't get to undo what I did to her or to anyone else. All I can do is spend the rest of my life trying to make sure fewer people experience what she did. It's not enough. I know that. But it's what I have. There was no applause. Just a heavy, thoughtful quiet. And somehow, that felt more powerful than clapping. Afterwards, she sat backstage, shoulders slumped. Did I say the wrong thing? She asked me. No, I said. You said the honest thing. And sometimes honesty isn't neat or satisfying. But it's real. That night, as I lay in my hotel room, I thought about the path we'd walked. It wasn't a clean arc from wrong to right, from pain to peace. It was jagged, messy, unfinished. And maybe that was the real lesson. That people are not stories with tidy endings. They're living, changing things. Months later, she left the company. Not in anger, but because she'd been offered a role with a nonprofit dedicated to combating bias in the airline industry. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. On her last day, she stood in my office doorway, just like she had that rainy afternoon when she'd first asked for a job. "I don't know if I've earned your forgiveness," she said. "Maybe that's not the point," I replied. "Maybe it's enough that you've earned my respect." She smiled then, small, genuine, unguarded. "That's more than I thought I'd get." And then she was gone. I still see her name sometimes in articles, on panels, in industry updates. Each time, I feel the same quiet satisfaction. Not because I think I saved her or because I want credit, but because I know the ending of our story is still being written, and every chapter after that flight is better than the one before. And maybe that's the real victory. Not that she changed, not that I did, but that, in a world where anger can be the easiest currency, we chose to spend something rarer, something that lasts longer.